The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Dodgeville, Kansas, as Eli Turner adjusted his worn hat and checked his pocket watch for the third time in 10 minutes. The stagecoach was due any moment, carrying the woman who would change his life forever, or so he hoped. At 42, Eli had grown weary of the endless silence that filled his ranch house, the empty conversations with his cattle, and the cold meals eaten alone by lamplight. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story now." "You sure you're ready for this, Turner?" called out Sheriff Ben Morrison from across the street, his weathered face creased with amusement. "Marriage ain't like breaking horses, you know." Eli managed a nervous smile. "Reckon I've been alone long enough, Ben. Time to see if I remember how to be around civilized folk." The correspondence with Miss Grace Murphy had been brief but promising. Her letters spoke of a woman seeking a fresh start, someone who valued hard work and simple pleasures. Eli had painted a picture of himself as a successful rancher, which was true enough, but had perhaps been less forthcoming about his reputation as the loneliest man in 3 counties. The thunder of hooves and creaking wheels announced the stagecoach's arrival. Dust swirled as the driver pulled the horses to a halt in front of the general store. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs as he approached, his mouth dry as prairie sand. "Whoa there!" shouted the driver, a grizzled man named Jake Henley. "Got a passenger for Dodgeville!" The door swung open and Eli held his breath. A worn boot appeared first, then another, and finally Grace Murphy stepped down from the coach. Eli's jaw nearly hit the ground. Grace Murphy stood nearly 6 feet tall, with shoulders that could have belonged to a lumberjack and arms that looked capable of wrestling a bull to the ground. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her green eyes sparkled with intelligence and determination. She wore a simple blue dress that strained against her powerful frame, and when she smiled, her entire face lit up like sunrise over the prairie. "You must be Eli Turner," she said, her voice rich and warm as honey. She extended a hand that could have crushed walnuts. "I'm Grace Murphy, and I'm mighty pleased to finally meet you." Eli stared for a moment, his prepared greeting stuck somewhere between his brain and his tongue. The woman before him was nothing like the delicate flower he'd imagined. She was a force of nature, a prairie storm in human form. Yes, ma'am. That's me," he finally managed, taking her hand. Her grip was firm enough to make his bones creak. "Welcome to Dodgeville." Around them, the townspeople had begun to gather, their whispers carrying on the wind like tumbleweeds. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house covered her mouth in shock. Young Tommy Peterson's eyes were wide as saucers. Even the horses seemed to sense the electricity in the air. "Well, I'll be," muttered Doc Williams, adjusting his spectacles. "That's one substantial woman." Grace seemed oblivious to the stares, or perhaps she was simply accustomed to them. She retrieved a battered carpetbag from the coach and looked around the town with obvious satisfaction. "It's beautiful here," she said, breathing deeply. "All this open space, these big skies. Back in Missouri, everything felt so cramped and small." "Missouri?" Eli asked, finding his voice again. "I thought you were from Illinois." Grace's smile faltered for just a moment. "Oh, well, I moved around quite a bit before settling on coming here. A woman alone has to be flexible." There was something in her tone that made Eli's instincts prickle, but he pushed the feeling aside. Everyone had secrets, especially folks looking to start over in a place like Kansas. "Let me show you to the boarding house," Eli offered, reaching for her bag. Grace hefted it easily, making him feel somewhat unnecessary. "That's kind of you, but I can manage. This old thing and I have been traveling companions for quite some time." As they walked down Main Street, Eli became acutely aware of every eye upon them. Grace, however, seemed to take it all in stride, nodding pleasantly to the gawking townspeople and commenting on the various shops and buildings. "That's a fine-looking church," she observed, pointing to the white-painted building at the end of the street. "I do hope what's his name?" "Reverend Matthews," Eli supplied. "I hope Reverend Matthews gives a good sermon. I've always been partial to a preacher who can really make the word come alive." They reached the boarding house where Mrs. Henderson waited on the porch, her expression a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed disapproval. "Mrs. Henderson," Eli said, tipping his hat, "I'd like you to meet Miss Grace Murphy, my intended." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. "Well, yes, of course. Welcome to Dodgeville, Miss Murphy. I have a room prepared for you." "That's very kind," Grace replied warmly. "I'm looking forward to getting to know everyone in town." As Mrs. Henderson led Grace inside, Eli found himself standing alone on the street, his mind reeling. This wasn't at all what he'd expected, but as he watched Grace's confident stride and heard her genuine laughter echoing from inside the boarding house, he felt something stir in his chest that had been dormant for far too long. "Well, Turner," Sheriff Morrison said, appearing at his elbow, "that's certainly not what any of us were expecting." "No," Eli agreed, still staring at the boarding house door. "It certainly isn't. You having second thoughts?" Eli considered the question seriously. Grace Murphy was nothing like the woman he'd imagined, but there was something about her, a strength, a warmth, a sense of purpose, that intrigued him more than any delicate flower ever could. "I don't rightly know, Ben, but I reckon I'm curious enough to find out." That evening, Eli sat on his porch, staring out at the endless prairie and thinking about the day's events. Grace had accepted his invitation to dinner tomorrow night, and he found himself both nervous and excited in a way he hadn't felt in years. As the stars began to appear in the vast Kansas sky, Eli made a decision. Whatever Grace Murphy's story was, whatever had brought her to this dusty corner of nowhere, he was going to give her and himself a chance. After all, the prairie had taught him that the most beautiful things often came in unexpected packages. The wind carried the sound of laughter from town, and Eli smiled, thinking it might just be Grace Murphy, filling the wide prairie air with joy as naturally as breathing. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Eli's ranch. He was mending a section of fence when he heard the approach of a horse and buggy. Looking up, he was surprised to see Grace Murphy handling the reins with the confidence of someone born to it, her powerful frame making the small buggy look almost comical. "Morning, Eli," she called out, bringing the horse to a stop near the fence. "I hope you don't mind me borrowing Mrs. Henderson's buggy. I wanted to see your spread before our dinner tonight." Eli set down his tools and walked over, removing his hat. "Not at all, though I have to say I'm impressed. Not many folks can handle old Bessie there. She's got a mind of her own." Grace laughed, the sound carrying across the open range. "Horses and I have always understood each other. My father used to say I was half horse myself, the way I took to them." "Your father was a horseman?" For a moment, Grace's expression grew distant. "Among other things. He taught me that animals can sense your intentions better than most people can. They don't judge you by your size or your past, only by how you treat them in the moment." Eli helped her down from the buggy, noting again the easy strength in her movements. "Sounds like a wise man." "He was." Grace's voice carried a note of sadness. "Lost him when I was 16. That's when I learned that being different isn't always a blessing, especially for a woman." They walked together toward the ranch house, Grace taking in everything with keen eyes. She paused at the corral where Eli's horses grazed, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "They're beautiful," she said, reaching out to stroke the nose of a curious mare. "This one's got spirit. What's her name?" "That's Starlight. She's my best cutting horse, but she's particular about who she lets ride her." As if to prove his point, Starlight nuzzled Grace's hand and whickered softly. Grace smiled and whispered something to the horse that Eli couldn't quite catch. "She likes you," Eli observed. "That's unusual. Starlight doesn't take to strangers easily. Maybe she recognizes a kindred spirit," Grace said with a wry smile. "We're both a bit larger than folks expect, and we both know what it's like to be judged before we're understood." They continued toward the house, and Eli found himself seeing his property through Grace's eyes. The ranch was modest but well-maintained, with a sturdy house, a good barn, and enough land to support a decent herd. It wasn't grand, but it was honest work and honest living. "It's peaceful here," Grace said as they reached the porch. "I can see why you love it." "It suits me," Eli agreed, "though it can get mighty quiet sometimes." Grace turned to face him, her green eyes serious. "Eli, I need to be honest with you about something. I know my appearance isn't what you were expecting, and I understand if you're having second thoughts about our arrangement." Eli studied her face, seeing vulnerability beneath the strength. "What makes you think I'm having second thoughts?" "I've seen that look before, the shock, the uncertainty. I'm not exactly what most men picture when they think of a wife." "That's true," Eli said slowly. "You're not what I pictured, but I'm starting to think that might not be a bad thing." Grace's eyebrows rose in surprise. "How do you mean?" "Well, I pictured someone delicate, someone who'd need protecting. But looking at you, I'm thinking maybe what I really need is someone strong enough to stand beside me, not behind me." A smile spread across Grace's face, transforming her entire countenance. That's not what I expected you to say." "I'm full of surprises," Eli said with a grin. "Speaking of which, would you like to see the inside of the house? I promise it's cleaner than it usually is." The house was indeed clean, though it bore the unmistakable marks of a bachelor's dwelling. The furniture was practical rather than beautiful, and there were few personal touches beyond a photograph on the mantelpiece and some books on a shelf. Grace moved through the rooms with interest, her presence somehow making the space feel more alive. She paused at the photograph, a family portrait showing a younger Eli with a woman and two small children. "Your family?" she asked gently. Eli's expression grew somber. "My wife Sarah and our children, Mary and James. They died in a fever outbreak 7 years ago." Grace's hand went to her heart. "Oh, Eli, I'm so sorry. It's why I've been alone so long. Couldn't see the point in trying again until recently." He looked at her directly. "What about you? Ever been married?" Grace was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the mantelpiece. "No, never married. Came close once, but, well, let's just say some men can't handle a woman who's not what they consider conventional." "His loss," Eli said simply. Grace looked at him with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. "You're a kind man, Eli Turner. I try to be. Life's hard enough without folks making it harder for each other." They spent the rest of the morning talking, and Eli found himself genuinely enjoying Grace's company. She was intelligent, well-read, and had a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard. When she laughed at one of his stories about a particularly stubborn bull, the sound filled the house in a way it hadn't been filled in years. As the sun reached its zenith, Grace prepared to leave. "I should get back to town. Mrs. Henderson will be wondering where her buggy's gotten to." "Grace," Eli said as she gathered her things, "tonight at dinner, would you mind if I asked you some questions? About your past, I mean. Not to pry, but if we're going to make this work, I'd like to know more about the woman I'm considering marrying." Grace's expression grew guarded. "What kind of questions?" "Nothing too personal, just where you came from, what brought you here. The usual things folks want to know about each other." "Of course," Grace said, though Eli noticed she didn't quite meet his eyes. "That's only fair." As she drove away, Eli watched from his porch, a nagging feeling in his gut that Grace Murphy was carrying secrets heavier than her impressive frame suggested. But everyone had secrets, he reminded himself. The question was whether hers were the kind that would matter. That evening, as he prepared for dinner, Eli found himself looking forward to the evening with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. Grace Murphy might not be what he'd expected, but she was certainly more interesting than anything that had happened in Dodgeville in a long time. Little did he know that before the night was over, Grace's secrets would begin to unravel in ways that would change both their lives forever. The Golden Nugget Saloon wasn't much to look at, but it served the best meals in Dodgeville, and Eli wanted to make a good impression. He'd reserved a corner table away from the usual crowd of cowboys and drifters, hoping for some privacy to get to know Grace better. Grace arrived precisely on time, wearing a deep green dress that complemented her eyes and somehow made her imposing figure seem more elegant than intimidating. Several patrons turned to stare as she entered, but she held her head high and walked directly to Eli's table. "You look beautiful," Eli said, standing to pull out her chair. "Thank you," Grace replied, settling into the seat with surprising grace. "This is lovely. I haven't had a proper dinner out in, well, longer than I care to admit." They ordered their meals and settled into comfortable conversation. Grace proved to be an engaging dinner companion, sharing stories about her travels and asking thoughtful questions about ranch life. But Eli noticed she skillfully deflected whenever he tried to learn more about her past. "So you mentioned Missouri earlier?" Eli said as they waited for dessert. "What part?" Grace's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Oh, here and there. I moved around quite a bit." "Family business?" "Something like that." Grace took a sip of her coffee, her eyes not quite meeting his. "What about you? Have you always lived in Kansas?" Eli recognized the deflection but decided not to push. "Born and raised about 50 miles east of here. Came to Dodgeville when I married Sarah. Her father owned the land that's now my ranch. It must have been hard, starting over after losing them. Hardest thing I've ever done. For a while I thought about selling everything and moving on, but this place, it holds too many good memories along with the sad ones." Grace reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. "I understand. Sometimes the places that hurt us the most are also the ones that heal us." There was something in her tone that made Eli look at her more closely. "Sounds like you're speaking from experience." Before Grace could answer, the saloon doors burst open with a crash that made everyone jump. 3 men strode in, their spurs jangling and their faces hard with purpose. Eli recognized the type immediately. Bounty hunters or lawmen, probably both. The leader was a tall, lean man with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. His eyes swept the room methodically before settling on Grace. Eli felt her entire body go rigid beside him. "Well, well," the scarred man said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet saloon. "Grace Murphy. Or should I say, Grace O'Malley?" Grace's face had gone pale, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man laughed, a cold sound that made Eli's skin crawl. "Oh, I think you do. We've been tracking you for 3 months, Grace. You led us quite a chase." Eli stood slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun at his hip. "I think there's been some mistake, friend. This lady's name is Murphy, and she's my intended bride." "Your intended bride," the scarred man repeated, his eyes glittering with amusement. "Well, ain't that something? Did she tell you about the bank in St. Louis, or maybe the stagecoach outside Kansas City?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Eli said firmly, though his heart was beginning to pound. "Name's Marshal Jake Thornton," the man said, pulling back his coat to reveal a badge. "And this here woman is wanted for robbery and assault. She's part of the O'Malley gang, one of the most dangerous outfits this side of the Mississippi." The saloon erupted in whispers and gasps. Eli felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, but he kept his eyes on Grace. Her face was a mask of resignation and something that might have been relief. "Is it true?" Eli asked quietly. Grace looked at him for a long moment, her green eyes filled with pain. "It's complicated." "Complicated?" Marshal Thornton snorted. "Lady, you and your brothers robbed 3 banks and 2 stagecoaches, left a trail of bodies from Missouri to here. That ain't complicated, that's criminal." "My brothers," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not me. I never hurt anyone. Maybe not directly, but you were there. You helped plan the jobs, you held the horses, I was trying to survive." Grace suddenly exploded, rising from her chair with such force that it toppled backward. "You think I had a choice? You think any woman has a choice when her brothers decide she's going to help them rob banks?" The raw pain in her voice made Eli's chest ache. He could see the truth in her eyes now, not the truth of guilt, but the truth of someone who'd been trapped by circumstances beyond her control. "Where are your brothers now?" Marshal Thornton demanded. Grace's shoulders sagged. "Dead. All 3 of them. Killed in a shootout with a sheriff's posse outside Topeka 2 weeks ago." Convenient, one of the other lawmen muttered. Convenient? Grace whirled on him, her eyes blazing. You think it's convenient that I watched my brothers, the only family I had left, die in a hail of bullets? You think it's convenient that I've been running for my life ever since, trying to find somewhere safe to start over? Eli stepped forward, placing himself between Grace and the marshals. Now hold on just a minute. If her brothers are dead and she wasn't directly involved in any violence, what exactly are you arresting her for? Accessory to robbery, conspiracy, harboring fugitives, Marshal Thornton rattled off. That's enough to see her hang, depending on the judge. But she came here to start over, Eli protested. She was trying to leave that life behind. The law doesn't work that way, friend. A crime's a crime, regardless of the circumstances. Grace turned to Eli, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'm sorry, Eli. I should have told you the truth from the beginning. I wanted so badly to be someone different, someone worthy of a good man like you. Eli looked into her face and saw not a criminal, but a woman who'd been dealt a terrible hand and had done her best to survive it. His decision came as naturally as breathing. Marshal, he said, his voice steady and calm, I'd like to post bail for Miss Murphy. Bail? Thornton laughed. Friend, there ain't enough money in this whole territory to— Try me, Eli interrupted, his tone carrying a quiet authority that made the marshal pause. Grace grabbed his arm. Eli, no, you don't understand what you're doing. I'm not worth— That's not for you to decide, Eli said firmly. And it's not for them to decide either. He looked at Marshal Thornton. Name your price. The marshal studied Eli for a long moment, clearly reassessing the situation. $5,000. Cash. The amount was staggering, more than most men made in 5 years. But Eli had been saving for years, living simply and banking most of his profits. More importantly, he'd inherited a substantial sum from Sarah's father, money he'd never touched, because it felt like blood money from his grief. Done, Eli said without hesitation. The entire saloon fell silent. Grace stared at him in shock, her mouth opening and closing without sound. You're serious? Marshal Thornton said slowly. Dead serious. But I have conditions. Miss Murphy stays in Dodgeville under my supervision until her trial. She doesn't leave town, and she reports to Sheriff Morrison twice a week. In return, she's not locked up like some common criminal. Marshal Thornton considered this, clearly weighing his options. And if she runs, then you can come after both of us, Eli said simply. Grace found her voice at last. Eli, you can't do this. You barely know me, and now you find out I'm a wanted criminal. Why would you? Because, Eli said, turning to face her fully. I've spent the last 7 years learning to read people, and I can see the difference between someone who's bad and someone who's been forced into bad circumstances. You're not a criminal, Grace. You're a survivor. Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks as she stared at him. You could lose everything. I could, Eli agreed, but I've already lost everything once. I know what that feels like, and I know what it's like to get a second chance. Everyone deserves that. Marshal Thornton shook his head in amazement. Well, I'll be damned. All right, Turner, you've got yourself a deal, but if she runs, I'm holding you responsible. Understood, Eli said. As the marshals left to make arrangements, Grace collapsed back into her chair, her hands shaking. Why? She whispered. Why would you risk everything for someone like me? Eli sat down across from her and took her trembling hands in his. Because Grace Murphy, or Grace O'Malley, or whoever you want to be, you're the first person in 7 years who's made me feel like I might have a future worth living. That's worth any risk. Grace looked into his eyes and saw something she'd never seen before. Unconditional acceptance. For the first time since her brothers had dragged her into their criminal life, she felt like she might actually have a chance at redemption. But as they sat together in the lamplight of the saloon, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows outside, a figure who had his own reasons for wanting Grace O'Malley found. The real danger was just beginning. 3 weeks had passed since Grace's arrest, and life in Dodgeville had settled into an uneasy routine. True to his word, Eli had posted the enormous bail, and Grace had moved into a small room above the general store, working during the day to help pay her keep and reporting to Sheriff Morrison twice weekly as required. The townspeople remained divided about Grace's presence. Some, like Doc Williams and Reverend Matthews, had come to see her as Eli did, a woman trying to escape a terrible past. Others, led by the sharp-tongued Mrs. Henderson, believed she was a dangerous criminal who would bring nothing but trouble to their peaceful community. Grace herself had thrown herself into honest work with a determination that impressed even her harshest critics. She helped at the general store, assisted Doc Williams with difficult patients who needed her strength, and had even begun teaching the local children to read on Sunday afternoons. Slowly but surely, she was proving that she was more than the sum of her past mistakes. Eli visited her every day, and their relationship had deepened beyond anything either had expected. The pretense of a mail-order bride arrangement had evolved into something real and profound. Grace's strength complemented Eli's quiet steadiness, and his unwavering faith in her had begun to heal wounds she'd carried for years. On this particular morning, Eli was helping Grace move some heavy supplies when Sheriff Morrison burst through the door of the general store, his face grim with urgency. "Eli, Grace, we've got trouble, big trouble." Grace immediately tensed, her hands stilling on the crate she'd been lifting. "What kind of trouble, Sheriff?" "The kind that rides into town at dawn with guns drawn," Morrison replied grimly. "There's a man outside who says he's Grace's brother. Claims the one who supposedly died in that shootout in Topeka." Grace's face went white as snow. "That's impossible. I saw them all die. I saw—" She stopped, her eyes widening with a terrible realization. "Sean. Oh God, it's Sean." "Who's Sean?" Eli demanded, moving protectively closer to Grace. "My youngest brother. He was supposed to be watching the horses during the shootout, but when the shooting started, I hoped. Grace's voice broke. "He must have run when he saw the others go down." "Well, he's here now," Morrison said. "And he's not alone. Got 4 men with him, all armed and looking for you. Says you've got something that belongs to him." Grace shook her head frantically. "I don't have anything. When I left Missouri, I took nothing but the clothes on my back." "What about the money from the robberies?" Eli asked quietly. "The brothers always kept it. I never saw a penny of what they stole. I was just—" She trailed off, her face suddenly going even paler. "Oh no, the map." "What map?" Morrison and Eli asked simultaneously. Grace sank onto a nearby crate, her hands shaking. "Before the last job, the bank in Jefferson City, my brother Patrick gave me a piece of paper. Said it was insurance in case something happened to them. I thought it was just one of his drunken ramblings, but—" "But what?" Eli pressed. "It was a map to where they buried their share of the money from all the robberies, thousands of dollars, hidden somewhere near the Missouri River." Grace looked up at them with desperate eyes. "I still have it. I kept it sewn into the lining of my dress, but I never looked at it. I just wanted to forget everything about that life." Sheriff Morrison whistled low. "That explains why your brother's here. How much money are we talking about?" "Patrick once bragged they'd stolen over $20,000 across all their jobs. If even half of that is buried somewhere, that's enough to kill for," Morrison finished grimly. Through the window they could see 5 men on horseback gathered in the middle of Main Street. The leader was a young man with Grace's green eyes and auburn hair, but where Grace radiated strength and warmth, he seemed to emanate cold menace. "That's Sean," Grace whispered. "He's only 22, but he's the most dangerous of all my brothers. Patrick and Michael had lines they wouldn't cross, but Sean enjoys the violence." "What does he want?" Eli asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The map, and probably revenge for what he sees as my betrayal of the family." Grace stood up, her jaw set with determination. "I have to face him. If I don't, he'll tear this town apart looking for me." "Like hell you will," Eli said firmly. "You're not going out there alone." "Eli's right," Morrison agreed. "We need a plan. Can't just let you walk into the street like some kind of showdown." Grace shook her head. "You don't understand. Sean won't negotiate. He won't listen to reason. The only thing he respects is strength, and even then, she looked at Eli with tears in her eyes. I won't let him hurt you or anyone else in this town because of me, and I won't let him hurt you, Eli replied with quiet intensity. We're in this together, Grace. That's what partners do. Before Grace could respond, the door to the general store burst open. Sean O'Malley strode in, his hand resting casually on the butt of his gun. He was tall and lean, with the kind of predatory grace that made experienced lawmen nervous. Hello, sister, he said, his voice carrying a soft Irish accent that made his words sound almost musical. You're looking well for a dead woman. Sean, Grace's voice was steady, but Eli could see the fear in her eyes. I thought you were killed with the others. Sorry to disappoint you, though I have to say I'm impressed. Running off to play house with some farmer while your own blood lies rotting in unmarked graves. His green eyes flicked to Eli with contempt. This your new man, Gracie? Bit soft-looking, isn't he? Eli stepped forward, his own hand moving toward his gun. I think you've said enough, friend. Sean laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Friend? Oh, that's rich. Tell me, friend, did my dear sister mention that she's the one who told the law where to find us? That she's the reason Patrick and Michael are dead? That's a lie, Grace gasped. Is it? Sean's smile was cruel. Then how did that sheriff's posse know exactly where we'd be? How did they know about the cabin by Miller's Creek? Grace's face crumpled. I would never. You wrote a letter, Gracie, to some lawman in Kansas City trying to make a deal. Trying to trade information for immunity. Sean pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. Found it in Patrick's things after the shooting. Want to explain this? With shaking hands, Grace took the paper and read it. Her face went from pale to ashen. I wrote this, but I never sent it. I was desperate, scared, but I couldn't go through with it. But Patrick found it, Sean continued relentlessly. Found it, and confronted you about it. That's why you ran, isn't it? Because you knew what would happen when the others found out. Eli watched Grace's world crumble around her. The woman who had seemed so strong, so determined to build a new life, was being systematically destroyed by her brother's words. Even if that's true, Eli said, stepping between Grace and Sean, it doesn't matter now. She's trying to build an honest life here. Sean's hand moved to his gun. Oh, but it does matter. You see, when family betrays family, there's a price to be paid. And Gracie here owes a debt that's been accumulating interest. What do you want? Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The map, for starters. Then we're going to take a little ride. You and me. Got some old friends who are mighty interested in having a conversation with you. She's not going anywhere, Eli said firmly. Sean's gun cleared leather with lightning speed. The barrel pointed directly at Eli's chest. I don't think you have much say in the matter, farmer. But before Sean could pull the trigger, Grace moved. With a speed that belied her size, she grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the store's display and brought it down on Sean's wrist with a sickening crack. The gun went flying as Sean howled in pain and rage. Run! Grace shouted to Eli and Morrison. Get everyone to safety! But Sean recovered faster than anyone expected. With his good hand, he pulled a knife from his boot and lunged at Grace. Brother and sister crashed into the store's shelves, sending goods flying everywhere. Eli drew his own gun, but the siblings were too entangled for him to get a clear shot. Grace was fighting for her life, using her size and strength to keep Sean's blade away from vital areas, but she was already bleeding from several cuts. Sheriff Morrison had run outside, shouting for the townspeople to take cover. Through the window, Eli could see Sean's men dismounting, their guns drawn as they prepared to storm the store. Grace! Eli shouted. The back door! But Grace was locked in mortal combat with her brother, and Sean was younger, faster, and driven by a rage that gave him inhuman strength. The knife flashed again, and Grace cried out as it found its mark in her shoulder. That's when Eli made his decision. He couldn't get a clear shot at Sean, but he could even the odds. With a roar of fury, He launched himself at the struggling pair, tackling Sean around the waist and driving him away from Grace. The three of them went down in a tangle of limbs, crashing through the store's front window in an explosion of glass and wood. They hit the street hard, and Eli felt something in his ribs crack from the impact. Sean rolled away and came up with his knife, his face twisted with murderous intent. But before he could strike, the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked froze everyone in place. "That's far enough," came a calm, authoritative voice. Marshal Jake Thornton stood at the end of the street, his rifle trained on Sean. Behind him were 6 more federal marshals, all armed and ready. "Sean O'Malley," Thornton called out, "you're under arrest for bank robbery, murder, and now assault. Drop the knife and surrender, or we'll drop you where you stand." Sean looked around wildly, realizing he was outnumbered and outgunned. His men had already thrown down their weapons and raised their hands. "This ain't over, Gracie," he snarled. "Family blood runs deep, and you can't wash it clean no matter how hard you try." "Maybe not," Grace said, struggling to her feet with Eli's help. Blood stained her dress, but her voice was steady. "But I can choose what kind of person I want to be from now on, and I choose to be better than what we were." Sean spat in the dirt and dropped his knife. As the marshals moved in to arrest him, he looked at Grace one last time. "You think this farmer will still want you when he learns the whole truth? When he finds out about the people who died because of what we did?" Grace met his gaze steadily. "That's his choice to make, but I'm done letting fear and guilt control my life." As Sean was led away in chains, Eli put his arm around Grace's waist, supporting her weight. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get Doc Williams to look at those cuts." "Eli," Grace said as they walked toward the doctor's office, "there are things about my past, things Sean alluded to, that you still don't know. If you want to walk away now, I'll understand." Eli stopped and turned to face her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Grace, I've seen you fight for your life, risk everything to protect this town, and stand up to the worst parts of your past. Whatever else happened before you came here, it doesn't change who you are now." Tears streamed down Grace's face. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've watched you choose to be good every single day, even when it would have been easier to run or give up. That's not something you can fake." He smiled and wiped away her tears with his thumb. "Besides, I told you once that everyone deserves a second chance. I meant it." As they reached Doc Williams's office, Grace turned back to look at the town that had become her home. The people of Dodgeville were emerging from their hiding places, and she could see a mixture of fear, curiosity, and something that might have been respect in their faces. Mrs. Henderson approached hesitantly. "Miss Murphy, Grace, are you all right?" "I will be," Grace replied. That was very brave what you did. Standing up to your brother like that." Grace managed a small smile. "It was time I stopped running from who I used to be and started fighting for who I want to become." Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly. "Well, for what it's worth, I think Dodgeville is lucky to have you." As Doc Williams tended to Grace's wounds, Eli sat beside her, holding her uninjured hand. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the town returning to normal. Children playing, merchants reopening their shops, life going on. "So," Eli said quietly, "when you're healed up, what do you say we make this engagement official? I mean, really official?" Grace looked at him in surprise. "Even after everything that's happened, everything you've learned about me? Especially after everything that's happened. You've proven you're exactly the kind of woman I want to spend my life with. Strong enough to face anything, brave enough to fight for what's right, and stubborn enough to keep me honest." Grace laughed through her tears. "Are you sure you know what you're getting into, Eli Turner?" "I'm sure I want to find out, Grace Murphy, or O'Malley, or whoever you decide to be." "I think," Grace said, squeezing his hand, "I'd like to be Grace Turner if you'll have me. I can't think of anything I'd like more." As the sun set over Dodgeville, Kansas, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, two lonely souls who had found each other against all odds began planning their future together. Grace's past would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined her destiny. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings and the hope that love really could conquer all, even in the unforgiving heart of the American frontier. The lonely rancher had waited for his mail-order bride, and a woman twice his size had arrived in town. But what he'd found was something far more valuable than he'd ever dared to hope for. A partner strong enough to stand beside him through whatever storms life might bring, and a love deep enough to weather any challenge. Their story was just beginning. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.